below. We're going to wait for a couple more people to come in since we haven't seen an audience yet on the screen, but perfect. Okay, so I'll introduce myself. My name is Brianna Catalanato. I am the Social Change Chair of the DePaul Activities Board, and this is the last installment of the 2020 to 2021 Let's Talk series for the school year. Throughout this quarter, to give a little insight into what Let's Talk is, the Social Change Committee has been doing a series throughout the quarter called Let's Talk, which we talk about certain topics and going in more depth about a specific topic. Some past events we've done has been mental health awareness and education disparities. And tonight we are doing one about human trafficking with an amazing organization called Selah Freedom. Yeah, so that's going to be the last installment for tonight. You can see on the banner below to check in on D-Hub to check in for the event. And yeah, so I am going to hand it over to Kara and she can talk about Selah Freedom.
Thanks, Brianna. Welcome, everyone. It's so good to be here. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to bring light to this conversation within the series. My name is Kara Thompson, as she said. I am a licensed social worker, but I serve as the Midwest Prevention Coordinator for Selah Freedom. So I'm going to put my screen on full here so that I can tell you a little bit more about kind of what is the work that we do at Selah Freedom, and how does this relate to human trafficking? How does this relate to exploitation of humans, of people? So Selah Freedom is a nonprofit we started about 10 years ago, and really started off when our founders had really recognized for the first time that the idea of what human trafficking or what sex trafficking was really, really different. The reality was really, really different than what they had thought previously, right? So typically when I talk about sex trafficking, human trafficking, I want you and encourage you to think about, okay, when I say those words, what images come to mind? What news stories come to mind? What Facebook articles come to mind? I think there's stuff on TikTok now. I'm not really on TikTok, but apparently that's what people are saying. And I want to today, in these minutes that I have, is to really tell you, what are we seeing exploitation looking like, right? And so Selah Freedom, like I said, started about 10 years ago. And we really started off to offer services to survivors. Right, so we have a residential campus that is in our southeast location, located in Florida, where we are serving adult women survivors of domestic sex trafficking and exploitation. And that process is more of a long-term process. We have different phases in our residential campus. One is assessment phase, so kind of more of the short term. And then if they're looking to stay in programming, they may transition either to a different program or with us continue it in residential. We also have an outreach team in that same region, which is working with law enforcement to provide training, but is also providing case management to survivors who maybe are in the life, maybe being exploited or in exploitative situations, and just need some extra support. Maybe they're not ready for programming yet, but we want to make sure that we can meet them where they are. Our outreach team is also involved in a court diversion program in order to provide services to survivors that way. And then we realized really quickly as an organization that we're out here talking about sex trafficking and exploitation, and the general public, it's known to look really different, right? And so we realized we needed that awareness arm to say, hey, this is really what it is, to fight for different legislation changes, and to kind of get the word out. And that's really how Selah Freedom had operated for a while. And I think it was really in working with survivors so closely, when we're hearing the stories over and over again of, I may be in my 20s in residential with Selah Freedom, but this started way earlier. This started when I was 12, 13, 14 years old. And back then I didn't even know what to call it. And so as an organization, when we're hearing that from our survivors, we have to take a step back and say, okay, what are we doing about our young people, right? How can we have conversations around this? So prevention arm is something that I'm biased because that's the department I work in, and I get to lead the Midwest team here. But we work with young people from kindergarten up, right? We'll do trainings with adults as well, like many of you, sometimes school staff, social workers, social service professionals, just so that we can have a conversation in hopes to further prevent exploitation. It's a big ask, it's a big goal, but we really believe that when we can talk about the issue in a way that feels really strength-based and empowered and not so fear tactic led, that there's a lot of work that we can do. So like I said, that's where my heart's at. So I'll bring in some stories and situations as we're going through today. But I also want to just kind of set the stage by really understanding, when we say human trafficking, sex trafficking, or CSEC, what does that really mean? Right? And so the work that Selah Freedom does is primarily with domestic sex trafficking survivors or with CSEC survivors. But I want to start by kind of talking about this whole idea of human trafficking, right? Under the umbrella of human trafficking, you have different types of exploitation, such as labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And then even within sex trafficking, there's different ways that it can look, right? We're going to talk a lot about that today. The fancy definition, or a simple way to, say the fancy definition when we think about sex trafficking, is when there's an exchange, a commercial sex act that's exchanged for something of value. And there's either force, fraud, or coercion. The caveat to that is that if we're talking about a minor, which is most of the time what I'm working with, the audiences I'm working with, you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. So what that means is that the law says, hey, if I'm a 17-year-old minor and I don't believe I'm being trafficked, I don't think I'm being trafficked, I just have a partner who's telling me that I need to go exchange sex for money to bring it back for our household. I may not even view myself as being a victim in that situation, but the law actually says otherwise. And so there's supportive services that can be offered, especially to minors who get themselves caught up in those situations, but even as adults as well, right? CSEC, I'm throwing a lot of words and a lot of acronyms at you, but CSEC stands for the Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children, which again is kind of a broad phrase. Child sex trafficking is included underneath that. But we also know that this idea of exploitation can be general, right? Anytime if you're exploited, there's someone else taking advantage of the situation or manipulating, right? And so what we want to be really clear, whether we're talking about CSEC, sex trafficking, human trafficking, we know that it's oftentimes an exchange for something of value, right? I am going to really be talking specifically about sex trafficking because that's kind of the bulk of the work that we do. And one of the things we find oftentimes is that with our survivors who have experienced trafficking or exploitation, there often is a previous story of child sexual abuse. And so understanding, okay, how does that intersect with this conversation, right? Like why do we think that some of the lived experiences from our survivors are also compounded on other trauma, other abuse that may have happened early on in life? And we also know that when we talk about exploitation, it is all about vulnerabilities, right? And so we're going to kind of dive into that. But I also want to be really clear as to what this issue is not. I am so passionate about making sure that the language that we're using is really strength-based, survivor-centered, and empowered, right? And so what we want to be clear is that someone who is being trafficked, especially a child being trafficked, we're not referring to the child as, oh, they're just a promiscuous child or a delinquent child. There's so much more to unpack underneath that, right? And that's true whether we're talking about a minor, a child, or if we're talking about an adult as well. Language is key. We really, really need to understand that. We'll talk more about it, and you'll hear my language kind of shift back and forth as we're going through today as well. Just to kind of give you some statistics, we do know that human trafficking is one of the fastest growing epidemics worldwide. And I'll say that, statistics can be really difficult. Statistics on victimization of any sort are really difficult. And the reason for that being that most of the time, or a lot of the time, disclosures aren't likely to happen from survivors, right? We work with a lot of survivors who it will take a long time, periods of months or maybe even years, for them to start understanding that maybe the situation I was caught up in that I thought was consensual, maybe there was actually some exploitation littered into that. Maybe I am a survivor, right? And that can take a lot of time and a lot of working through and processing to get a survivor to maybe realize or start making those realizations for themselves. So we know statistics are difficult to find, but this one we know is true, right? We know that this is a really growing epidemic, unfortunately. It's estimated that human trafficking is about a $99 billion industry, tied at around the second largest criminal enterprise worldwide. So if we think about the top three criminal enterprises, right? Drug trafficking, weapon trafficking, and human trafficking, these things can be intermingled as well, right? If you've heard anyone talk about human trafficking or sex trafficking before, you may have heard the metaphor or using the example of when we think of someone who's trafficking drugs, if I'm a dealer and I'm providing someone drugs, once I sell them, I need to re-up, I need to go get more. And so this issue looks really different when we're talking about human trafficking and we're talking about a human being, right? Where this person may be selling their body or being forced into exploitation multiple times a day. And so unfortunately, we know that that can lead to this kind of really big growing issue that can be really hard to identify and really hard to tie back down. We do also know, or the estimate is that there's about 2 million children globally that are affected by the sex trade. This is an incredibly difficult statistic to read or to talk about, but it's so important for us to recognize, right? Again, in thinking about what information did we think we knew about human trafficking or sex trafficking before listening to this or coming to this conversation. And what I want to do is help us understand that what if it really looks different, right? I walk into a lot of rooms where someone will say, yeah, I know exactly what human trafficking is. I saw the movie Taken, or I saw the news story, or I saw the crime show talking about when someone is being kidnapped and then they're sent somewhere else and then they're physically bound. The reality is that the exploitation that we're seeing in the US with survivors that we work with the young people that I work with, looks vastly, vastly different. And so if we don't know that, and if we're not able to recognize that there may be different ways that human trafficking looks, it can be so hard to recognize those signs, right? It can be so hard to really stand up and be able to advocate against it when we don't even have a clear vision of what that looks like. I talked a little bit before about this idea of child sexual abuse being a route to further exploitation. It's something that we've seen with the survivors that we work with. It's something that we've seen backed up in research also. And so unfortunately, we know that about 1 out of every 10 children in the US will experience some sort of sexual harm before their 18th birthday. We got to get real with that. We got to start talking about how maybe the conversation that many of us grew up learning around stranger danger, is that the end of that conversation, right? One of the things that we know is that similar tactics that are used by traffickers or exploiters, the grooming, the trust building, the befriending, these are things that we often see as tactics used by abusers of sexual abuse as well. And so we want to be really understand that so we can understand the connection between them and empower our young people to say, hey, what if we thought that we could trust this person, but then they did something to our body that made us feel unsafe? Even if they're a family member, are we still allowed to tell our safe adult about it? They're not a stranger. So helping kids start to think through that, to give them a voice, to empower them in their own decision making and talking to safe adults is so important. So something that we really focus big on. I do also want to make sure that I refer to gender. I mentioned before that in our residential programming, Selah Freedom serves predominantly women identifying survivors of domestic sex trafficking. But I want you to notice that when I'm talking about the issue as a whole, I want to be really clear that this is not just an issue that affects women and girls. The stats here on this screen are from 2018, and they estimate about 96% of survivors of human trafficking identify as female and about 4% of male. At first, we could talk about how the fact that we're only looking at two genders here too, right? So that's a concern. That's something we got to talk about. But I also want us to think about maybe kind of be a little critical or maybe question those statistics. Can we honestly say that we have a society that makes it safe for any survivor to disclose abuse or trafficking? And with that said, does our society make it really easy for our boys, for our male identifying youth, for our gender nonconforming youth, our LGBTQ youth to talk about it either? And the answer is no, right? So while we know this issue affects women and girls at higher rates, we also want to make sure that we're not leaving out of the conversation those that identify as other genders. And so in talking about the boys, one unfortunate thing is that we think about boys' experience of victimization and exploitation or human trafficking. There's not a whole lot of great research on it. There's more and more coming out, and I have a documentary that I'll suggest called Boys documentary. I believe it's accessible on Vimeo now. And it does a great job at kind of just giving scenarios and stories from male survivors of exploitation, because again, that voice is so important. But when we think about and we kind of talk about male identifying survivors as a whole, we know that the average age of entry was about 15 years old. About 44% said they were introduced into the life by their peers. And oftentimes the vulnerabilities are very similar. We will sometimes hear a little bit more conversation around our boys being exploited to meet basic needs, food, shelter. Maybe we're talking about boys who are on the run, right? Don't come from stable housing, and how that could affect their vulnerabilities for being further exploited. And then with that, I also want to make sure that we leave space to talk about our LGBTQ plus gender nonconforming youth. And if we know that we think that they represent about 5 to 10% of the general youth population, but then represent about 40% of the homeless youth population, we could have a whole other conversation for an hour just about that and the concerns there. But again, we know that the vulnerability can be really high. And not because of their sexual identity or gender identity, but unfortunately, we live in a society where not all people are accepted. Oftentimes, we will talk to survivors who felt very oppressed and marginalized by their identity or by their lived experience. And so again, we want to just make sure that we're really highlighting the voices of all survivors, not just certain genders, even though different programs will kind of specialize in focusing and working with survivors in different ways. Now I want you to think about, kind of bringing it back to what we talked about earlier, where have you heard sex trafficking taking place, or human trafficking as a whole, right? Again, I know I'm talking about sex trafficking more specifically, but we can even make this broad. What news stories have you heard? One of the things that comes up a lot when I get to do this training live with audiences is this idea of, okay, well, I hear about truck stops, I hear about third world countries, I hear about massage parlors, I hear about the Super Bowl. And yes, we know that exploitation happens in those places, but we also know that list is really extended beyond that as well. Right? Take the Super Bowl, for example. It is so important that there's this increased awareness that comes around big sporting events such as the Super Bowl. There's a lot of times, a lot of really strong campaign efforts, survivor focused, on the groundwork level work that happens on those weekends, because we know that where there are sporting events, major sporting events, we know that demand can increase. We know where demand increases, trafficking and exploitation is likely to follow. And so while it's so important to talk about what human trafficking looks like on Super Bowl weekends, I want to encourage us to really realize that it doesn't just happen that weekend, right? Like if the Super Bowl's in Atlanta next weekend, it's not saying that any other weekend in Atlanta there's not going on. It is, we just need to know how to look for it, right? Another place that we see a lot more, especially within this last year and a half with COVID, is how online platforms are being used to recruit, to groom, to lure, to solicit within sex trafficking specifically. And so again, just reading this list, I want you to kind of think about, broaden your idea of, can this happen in the suburbs? Can this happen in the city? Does this happen in all neighborhoods in the city? Absolutely. Does it maybe look different? Sure. But it's still a crime. It's still an opportunity for us to meet survivors where they're at and offer support in the best way possible. I told you it happens everywhere. Here's a map to prove that. This comes from, I believe, Polaris Project, who is the organization that runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end here. But just to prove that, this is reported sex trafficking cases. Literally everywhere, right? If you think about it, if you're a Chicago-based listener and you're a watcher and you're looking at this map, we are covered in red. So we got to think about that. If it's all around us, but if we really don't know what it looks like, how can we be more aware and more educated? I talked a little bit before about online traps. This is something that we spend a lot of time talking to young people about. And again, I think our young people have heard a lot about, watch out for the creepy person who messages you on Instagram, or watch out, you never know if they're really the person they say they are on the other side of the screen. And that is so true, and something that we really want to reinforce. But I also want to make sure we add to the conversation, what if the person who's pushing a young person's boundaries online isn't some random stranger, but is someone they actually knew? Maybe someone around their same age. This brings up this conversation about recruitment that we talk a lot about with our young people. A recruiter is someone who acts sort of as an assistant to the trafficker, but whose job or one job is to learn about other young people and recruit them, bring them into the life, right? Introduce them into the life. Recruiters are oftentimes victims too, survivors as well. They may not be able to recognize that victimization, or they may be more aware. And so what we're seeing online happening is kids or young adults looking through Instagram, for example, and seeing an Instagram page where this person looks about their age and their life looks awesome. Like they've got all this nice stuff, they've got cash, they've got these gifts, and thinking, okay, what's so hard about, like, clearly they're doing something right. So let me reach out to them and ask them how they get that. And so recruiters' job is to make the life seem great, to make it seem like, yeah, there's no exploitation here. It's all by choice, right? We see that even among our young adults, especially within our college campuses, right? The idea of what's presented as a job opportunity or an opportunity to make extra cash could look really different than the reality of it. And so it's so important to address that the online traps exist. And we also know when we think about minors, it is not uncommon for a young person to receive some sort of sexual solicitation online, right? This stat says 1 in 9 youth receive online sexual solicitations. I'm going to go ahead and say that I think it's way more than that. I think this is another stat that's really underreported, right? Especially working with youth, when I get to ask this question to groups of youth or one-on-one with youth, that answer looks really different. So again, let's think about, why is this? How is technology being used? Technology is great. Social media is not always bad, but it's a really easy way to express our story and our vulnerability. And if that gets into the hands of someone with the wrong intentions, we want to make sure that we're also aware and can recognize when things seem a little bit too good to be true. And that can be really difficult, especially for our young people online. And so ultimately, when we think about human trafficking, sex trafficking, it's all about promises. Someone is presenting to someone else this myth or this great opportunity or this loving relationship or this great adventure, right? Where the promise versus the reality can look really different. We know it's not uncommon for threats, violence to be used as a tactic once that trafficker is able to build that trusting relationship with the individual, to kind of start implementing some of those more violence-based control tactics. It's not uncommon for substance use to be a part of human trafficking, sex trafficking, exploitation, in hopes from the trafficker's perspective that they would be able to control the victims if they're under the influence of substances. And so again, when we think about, okay, this myth versus reality of what's presented to a survivor, we want to make sure that we're also recognizing, okay, how can we as other adults, as people who maybe are not in the life, not being exploited, how do we know what to look for? So I want to pause, and as I'm kind of, previewing this, I want you to think about, what signs do you think you would be able to notice if someone was being trafficked? We know that there are some cases of trafficking that involve kidnap, physical force, physical change, but I'll tell you that is oftentimes not what we're seeing. Majority of the time, the individual in the relationship with the trafficker really for some period of time believed that this trafficker was there to support them, cared about them, provided for them in some capacity, right? It's not uncommon for the survivors we work with, their traffickers to be family members, to be friends, partners. And so the signs may look a little different. So I'm going to throw them out here up on the screen and just kind of talk about a few of them with my time left. So maybe this looks like someone who's really struggling to get their story straight. Maybe this is someone who is really kind of being secretive about where they're going or who they were with, or maybe they have a really rehearsed story. Like you ask them, like, hey, like, what did you do last weekend? And it's like the same thing every single time. That could be a red flag. Unexplained expensive gifts is a really important bullet point that I just want to make sure that I call out. This is something we see a lot with our youth and our young adults, but also into adulthood as well. It's not uncommon for a trafficker or for recruiters to start off by building that trust by also giving someone what they want, material gifts, whether that's housing, whether that's a new pair of shoes, getting your nails done, getting your hair done, like whatever that person wants. Like it's specific to each survivor, right? Whatever they want or they're yearning for is oftentimes offered to them as a way to say, hey, look, I got you. I can take care of you. I can be there for you. And maybe at the time, there's no expectation that there's anything to do in return. That could change though. Maybe months down the road, you have a trafficker who says, I need you to do this to go on this date with this person or to have sex with this person for something of value. And the survivor says, well, no, I'm not going to do that. And then the trafficker says, yeah, but who bought you those shoes? Who gave you a place to stay? And so there's some guilt that can be riddled within that as well. Unexplained tattoos can be another sign, often referred to within the field as branding, used as a control tactic from traffickers, where they will convince or manipulate or force maybe their survivors to get a tattoo that represents their ownership to a trafficker or to some other being. That's something to definitely look out for. There's some really awesome organizations, especially in Chicagoland, that will do pro bono work in covering those up or removing those tattoos for survivors who are out of the life, which is super cool. Okay, middle category, poor health or behavior. This one's a bit more self-explanatory. If you're noticing a shift in behavior, in health, right? This is maybe an individual who you're noticing really poor health, physical health. And that could even look like malnutrition, right? Or maybe this is someone that you're seeing different signs of physical abuse. So a little bit more clear signs, or maybe it's someone who's trying to cover them up. Or maybe someone who is especially anxious around individuals that maybe they weren't previously anxious around, right? If we're talking about a friend situation, you have a friend and they're telling you all this stuff before, and now you're noticing them backing off, and you're noticing other signs going on too. That's something we want to look for. And then the last column here is lack of control. Human trafficking, sex trafficking, exploitation is all about this power and control. And so a big sign, if you have someone who is not in control of their things or their voice, it's a really big sign that there's something unhealthy and toxic going on, right? Could be an unhealthy relation or abusive relationship, or it could be trafficking, or it could be exploitation, right? It can look a lot of different ways. And so be mindful of, is this individual able to speak for themselves, right? And I want us to think too, and be honest about our own stereotypes and ideas of, I'm not just talking about how maybe the person in control is this older individual. What if they're the same age? What if it's a relationship? And there's still one person in the relationship that really doesn't have a voice in it. Is that something we can identify and try to wrap services and support around if that individual is looking for it? With that, I want to give resources. I know I kind of gave just a really quick overview, but I want us, in thinking about this issue and as we really explore what does this really look like, I encourage you to do your own research as well, right? Like, again, this looks so many different ways. The idea that seduction, friending, are two of the most common tactics that are used by exploiters, that looks really different than what oftentimes the media is portraying. If you are interested in learning more about organizations near you, obviously Selah Freedom's information is here as well. But if you Google the National Human Trafficking Hotline, there's actually an area where you can search by state, and you can look at all the different organizations in your area that are doing work with survivors in some capacity. That's going to be a really great opportunity, one, to learn more about the work they're doing, what resources are out there, but also get a better idea of what does this issue really look like, right? Talking to different staff members, to different organizations, and really understanding, what are they seeing? What are they experiencing? What are the survivors that they work with saying and feeling? Can be a really, really, really huge learning piece and opportunity. Obviously, Selah Freedom's information is there as well. Our number down there if you're interested in more information, or if you have someone who is looking for human trafficking, sex trafficking related services, call. If we're not the answer, if we can't, be the provider, then we'll connect you to someone who can, right? So we just want to be there as a resource. And then, of course, if you see something, please say something. You can make anonymous reports to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. The number's listed there. If you Google it, they have a great, really informative webpage. And you can also text. There's a texting code for those of us that maybe don't love the phone call conversations, or maybe aren't in a space that's safe to have that phone conversation. I think one of the things in doing this work and working with survivors, whether young people or adults, is really emphasizing the fact that survivor voice matters, survivor lived experience matters, and then being able to, as professionals or as supportive people in an individual's life, recognize that maybe it may take some time. Right? It's not common for survivors of human trafficking to self-identify, to come up to you and say, hey, I need help. I'm a survivor of human trafficking. oftentimes that journey looks a little different than that. And so making sure that you're able to support them in the way that's healthy and safe for you and for them, but most importantly, connecting with other services and organizations that can help support that as well. So that's my spiel for now. I'm going to take my screen down, and then if we have any questions, Brianna, I'm welcome to answer them.
All right, perfect. So I forgot to mention in the beginning, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. You can also see on the banner below, it says the same. But yesterday we asked on our Instagram page, DAB_DePaul, for any questions for this event. And the first question that we have is, what should we as students be doing to help put an end to human trafficking?
It's such a powerful question. That's a big one. And I think there's so many different things, but I really want to encourage this, the first step of just learn. The fact that for those of you that are listening and watching this, I mean, that is a huge step. I recognize that there is a lot of heaviness in our world, and it can be really hard sometimes when we have an issue such as human trafficking, where it can almost feel overwhelming and daunting of like, okay, like I don't even know where to start. And there are so many incredible survivor leaders, organizations, podcasts, documentaries out there that can just start the conversation and show different perspectives from different lenses of what human trafficking looks like. And so I think it's really important to kind of diversify that education and what you're learning, so that you can see it and hear it from different people in different ways that are doing the work that might be under the same umbrella in the same field, but may look really differently depending on the population that they're serving.
It's really important to educate yourself on this. For so long I've educated, because it's like such a big problem, because I'm from the state of Florida. So just as showed within the slides, it's such a huge problem over there, especially in the whole country.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The next question we have is, what do you do if you think someone is a victim, but you're not sure?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And that can be a really hard position to be in, right? And so not knowing the relationship, that relationship could look different. If it's a close friend, a family member, we may want to just offer a safe space to say, hey, I noticed that you're acting a little different. I don't want to dig, but I just want to let you know that I'm here. I'm here for you when you need it. I think opening that space is so important. I'll tell you that even our outreach team, I mentioned, they are working with survivors directly who are still in the life. It typically takes 7, 8, 9 interactions with a survivor before they drop the idea of like, oh no, this isn't, you don't know me, this isn't what's going on, I'm not a victim. And maybe it takes a little bit longer for them to start recognizing maybe there are some patterns going on. Maybe there is something that I didn't tell you before that I want to open up. So creating that space is important. And then reporting, knowing how to offer resources. If we're talking about a minor, it's really important that we recognize that a suspected minor being exploited is a mandated report or call. So we want to make sure that we're supporting that young person in the ways that we need to and that are best for them. But I'm a big proponent of safe spaces and kind of giving people information, letting them make choices on their own so that they feel really empowered in their decision as well.
Definitely. We have a question from Facebook, so I'll put it on the screen. Are you aware of any major human trafficking schemes happening in the Midwest? If so, what can we look out for?
Yeah, that's a really great question. A lot of the work that I do with youth survivors, or that Selah Freedom does with survivors, it can look a lot of different ways. And I think sometimes even when the news picks up on major trafficking schemes, it can actually be really sensationalized. And so what I mean by that is the way that trafficking is presented could look different. So I'll give an example of like Wayfair situation. For those of you who aren't aware, earlier this year, there was this whole thing where it was like, okay, we gotta, there's this human trafficking awareness because there's suspected children that are being sold on the black market through a furniture platform, essentially. And while, in a way, it's like, okay, yes, people are talking about trafficking. It was actually really concerning because they're like, yeah, but they're not really talking about trafficking the way that we see it happening. And we don't even really know if this is accurate and true, right? And so to answer the question, really what to look out for is, instead of looking for those big, obvious schemes, it's really, how can I be able to show up for the people in my life and notice the little changes that I'm seeing? Maybe this looks like, I work with a lot of staff who are working with young people who are youth in care, who have some involvement with DCFS. And maybe if we have a young person who is constantly running away, constantly coming back with gifts, that's something to really look for, especially in Chicagoland area. We are such a hub for so many great things. We're also, unfortunately, a hub for exploitation for a lot of different reasons, right? We have a lot of really cool things that come to Chicago, like big events. We have a lot of different types of people. We have a big tourist industry. We have a great access to transportation. And so it's really looking beyond, in my case, working with the young people and saying, oh, they're just making bad decisions, they're just a bad kid, and really being able to look out for, okay, but where are those decisions coming from? What may be going on behind the scenes as well?
Leading on from that, since we kind of mentioned it, someone also asked on our Instagram page, what is the most dangerous myth about human trafficking?
That's such a good one. There's so many to pick from, so it's so hard to pick one. I think the most dangerous myth is that a survivor has control, or has a survivor, while they're being trafficked, that's a choice that they're making, that they're a bad person for making other choices. And I say that because I think that's so damaging, first and foremost, to the survivor, who is not really getting the support that they need to recognize that, hey, yeah, maybe running away wasn't a good idea, but you never deserved to be trafficked. You never deserved to be exploited. It's not your fault. I don't think we have enough survivors that really hear it's not your fault. People will believe you. People will support you. Even if maybe other unfortunate things had happened in the situation, I really want to make sure that survivors understand that they're can be believed. And so the myth that, oh, well, if someone's in the life, I had a staff person one time who made a comment of, well, that 16-year-old she's just trafficking herself. And that's not possible. And that language can be really, really damaging. One, to the survivor, but two, to other adults who you're saying that to, who then believe and think, oh yeah, maybe they are just trafficking themselves. And so I think that would be the biggest myth. But I will say there's a survivor leader, Rebecca Bender, who has a really awesome myths versus facts campaign, and has I think she gives like 10 different myths. And so I would encourage people to look out for that resource as well.
Yeah, it's definitely important, because just with like the media and the implications that it's shown with human trafficking, there's so much miscommunication about what survivors and what they go through.
Yeah, and also this idea that it's not uncommon for a survivor to be told all those victim blaming things by their trafficker. So when we as supportive adults say that, it reinforces what they're hearing, right? So for example, a young person whose trafficker may say something like, well, I didn't lock you up. You could leave if you want to. If they're hearing that from the abuser, from the exploiter, and then also hearing that the question of, well, why didn't you just leave, from professionals in their life, that really puts them in a space where, are we really setting up this young person a safe space to come forward and to disclose and feel supported? So really being mindful of that as well.
We have the last few questions. I will say again, if you have any more questions, put them in the chat and we'll answer them. One of the other ones, you kind of touched on this in the PowerPoint, but is human trafficking found on college campuses?
Yeah, absolutely it is. And it can sometimes look, again, I keep saying this, it looks a lot of different ways, but it really does, right? And that's really why I think that education from multiple perspectives is so important. One thing that we're seeing more and more of, and seeing this growing concern of, is the way that escort services, web camming services, how that could lead to further exploitation, and just really making sure that young people, even if they're adults, that they also know that they have rights and boundaries, and a right to safety and security. And so understanding, and what if we're presented with an opportunity that sounds one way but can look really different. And so the idea of like sugar babying can be something that is brought up into the conversation around exploitation. We've worked with survivors before who were recruited into the life through those types of quote unquote business, opportunities, and found that it being quite a bit exploitative and really different than what was promised up front. So that's something just to kind of call out. And we also know that all humans have vulnerabilities, whether you're a college kid, whether you're 16, or whether you're 56, right? Especially when we think about what our world has gone through over the last year and a half, and how financial insecurity has been something that is more a part of individuals' lives than maybe before COVID, and how that can lead to increased vulnerabilities as well and risk factors.
Definitely. Thank you for that. And then our last question for the night is any human trafficking documentary recommendations, podcasts?
Yeah, there's some really, really good ones. So 3 that like pop into mind as definitely go check them out. The first is called I Am Jane Doe. You may have heard of it before. It used to be on Netflix, and I'm not sure if it still is. So you may have to Google it. But it essentially follows the story of a few families whose teens were in the life, were being trafficked, and through online exploitation, right? Follows the story of some families who they actually found their missing teens being presented and solicited on things like Backpage.com. And it actually goes into a little bit more about SESTA and FOSTA, which is some legislation that came out a few years back, basically saying that, hey, websites need to be held accountable when they know that exploitation and trafficking is happening on them. And so that is an incredibly powerful documentary that I would really suggest. The other 2, very young girls out of an organization out on the East Coast called GEMS, which is an incredible survivor-centered organization. That documentary really focuses around the story of a few young girls, minors and young adults, and really shows how it's a really complex thing to work with a survivor of trafficking, where maybe one day they're ready to leave their trafficker, and maybe the next they're not ready to do so, and so they go back. And so it really takes you through that reality and what that relationship looks like. And then the last one is called Boys. Just Boys. If you Google Boys documentary sex trafficking, you should be able to find it. I believe it's on Vimeo as a way to access that, and does an incredible job at kind of telling the story from a male survivor perspective. And you actually get to meet a few different male identifying survivors and hear a little bit more about their story. So lots of really awesome resources, but those are the 3 that definitely, I'm like, everyone I talk to, I'm like, you got to go watch these 3. Like, then you'll really have a start to understanding as to what this issue really looks like in our country.
Yeah, I can highly recommend I Am Jane Doe. I've watched that before. It's a sensitive topic, but it's so important to know about. But yeah, definitely, I can't wait to watch this. I have those written down, so I will watch this. But yeah, so that is the end of our Let's Talk for human trafficking. I want to thank Kara for being here and doing an amazing job with showcasing this epidemic that's been happening for so long that a lot of people know about, but just don't know enough. But,
yeah.
Perfect.
And I really encourage people to, just before we get off, like, while it's a conversation that feels really heavy, my hope is that by talking about it, we can really feel empowered to know what to look out for in ways that we didn't know before. And so, as cheesy as it is to be like, if everyone who listens to this tells 5 other people, like, it's actually so true though, like the ripple effect in having this conversation and realizing that maybe we don't need to wait for bad things to happen to start talking about them. It's a really big shift. And so again, thanks for everyone who tuned in. It's such an awesome opportunity to be able to work with you, Brianna. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So yeah, that is the end of our event. As you can see on the banner below, we have some upcoming events for this week. This whole week is basically, excluding this event, this whole week is Twilight themed. So starting on Wednesday at 5 p.m., we're gonna have trivia where you can win some Amazon gift cards. And then Friday night, which I'm really excited for, we have Drive-In DePaul, which will be showing Twilight, the first one of the series, at 7:30. The screening will start at 8, but make sure you come at 7:30 so you can secure a spot because we're expected to have a lot of people there. And the first, I think 100 people that show up get a prize. So yeah, make sure you stop by, check us out on D-Hub for all our upcoming events. Check us out on our Instagram page, dab_DePaul. And we'll be posting more information about Selah Freedom on our Instagram story later tonight. So once again, thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you soon.